So I've been discussing some of the finer points of the lore of Cyrodiil and of Oblivion, and I've kind of acted like you guys already knew all of it. I mean, I'm sure some of you came from playing Skyrim, so you know about what the Empire is, and you know about maybe a little bit of like the lore of the Elder Scrolls because it's in all the books. The Oblivion and Crisis, Tiber Septim and his empire, maybe some of the periods before then. But I'd like to, just in case you don't know, give a little bit of backstory on the open world environment that is Cyrodiil and try to kind of like walk you guys over to the point we're at now in the lore. So basically, this region of Cyrodiil starts out where the first people that really came there were these elves that came from Somerset Isle, what was once called Aldmeris. Aldmeris is a term for like another continent that's apocryphal, but for all intents and purposes, we'll call the original elves the Aldmer. And they're very similar to the way the Altmer we see now are, who call themselves a cultured people who descended from the Aldmer. We can, for all intents and purposes, say that the Aldmer culture was like a prehistoric and very like precise version of what it means to be an elf in the Anuic way. So they had their traditions. They had Auriel, who was like their version of Akatosh, who was more like eagle-like, who was also a time god, and also a mortal in a way, kind of like it's a weird cosmology because you have to remember that the elves themselves consider themselves deprecated gods that were the Atada, the divided spirits of the Atada. So making the distinction between the all-powerful Aedra that is Akatosh or Auriel and them, they consider themselves in a weird sort of way like loyal and feal, but also on a similar standing cosmically with Akatosh. Even though Akatosh and Lorcan were two interbound principles, intertwined like twins, two sides of a coin, those were the first principles that were the byblows in the whole cosmology of Anu, Padme, Sithis, Anuiel, and then Auriel. But they also kind of considered Auriel to be a mortal king in a way that kind of descended but also reascended to a role in both Mundus and Aetherius. And the people that left this place, Somerset Isle, they had a very similar view of the religion, and overall they basically believed in the Aedric pantheon that the elves worshipped, with characters like Finaster, Ciribane, Ifre, and some of the other gods I believe were included, like Mara. But they had, I think, some political differences and matters of autonomy. And we see this pattern in the elven history of different groups. Later, the Valathi, who had a very strong sectarian disagreement, to put it lightly. Basically a whole like schism in which they decided to forsake the Aedra, go with the Daedra, and they became the ancestors of the Dark Elves. Some people would say that the Dwemer, for example, started out as like another group among the Aldmer. I'd like to beg to differ because it would make it more interesting if the Dwemer split at a much earlier point, to still just perhaps be called Mer, but to have had their own cities as far back as the War of the Manifest Metaphors, which is basically the war that the ancestors of men had, the Wandering Elnathe, and the ancestors of elves had, the Mer, who were the old Elnathe who were settled. The Wandering Elnathe were in a state of chaos, nomadic, and the old Elnathe had some sort of contempt for them, and battle lines were drawn between the Aedra that supported Lorcan, such as Kinnereth or Kine. The whole mythopoeia and the pantheons differ on these positions because, of course, as you'll later find, the lore or the religion of Cyrodiil was such that they had to kind of like combine Nordic and Nedic traditions with some of the Elven traditions to try to make a compromise between some of the Ayleid supporters of the Empress Alesia that ascended and the Nedic populations who are now free. So that's how they were building the society at that time, and at that time the society was kind of in like a precarious state of redress and balance. I believe there's a period of Roman history called like the Contest of the Lictors, in which the plebeians gained power in the Republic over the patricians. But in any case, getting back to the original founding of Cyrodiil, which in the Ayleid tongue means the heartland, Cyr, the heart, and Odil, which means land. These elves ended up becoming known as Heartland High Elves and Ayleids, and they established cities not unlike the cities you would find in the Somerset Isle, but of a different architectural style than you might see now. If you play ESO, or if they have any modern renditions where they show examples of Ayleid architecture. If you played Skyrim, you might notice some degree of similarity between the way that the Snow Elves had styled their architecture and the way that the Ayleids in Oblivion style their architecture. This is more of like an out-of-universe thing for resource and like creative design directions, but in the Elder Scrolls Online, a lot of the world's ruins that would be Elven are in an Ayleid style. And I think for some cases, this might be that the Ayleids were actually quite diffuse. But in other cases, I think it's because they wanted to minimize assets that they had to use in creating separate assets and the complexity of the product they're producing, and to reduce overhead and to increase profit, so on and so forth. You might take ruins that should be in the style of like Falmer that might be a little different than what the Ayleids had and put them there. In the cases of like High Rock in, I believe, Shiver Point, it's called, there is an Ayleid ruin on the coast. And that would possibly be true because the Ayleids did move to the area of High Rock and up into northwest Tamriel ever since they lost power in Cyrodiil, and they were unwelcome there, to put it lightly. But I digress to say that there are a lot of different places that might have not been Ayleid, but had Ayleid architecture in that portrayal, so that's something to keep in mind. But they were in a lot of places. Valenwood, Barsebic Ayleids, and the Black Marsh region. In the case of Cyrodiil specifically, they worshipped the Aedra, and they built a society, of course, centered on magic and on mystic notions of like the stars that perhaps have since been lost in the context culturally of like modern elves that might have been specific to their society. But they eventually turned to Daedric worship. Now, if you played Skyrim, or you know a little bit about the Elder Scrolls, the Daedra that I've been speaking about are like these extremely powerful, infinite, like totally vibrant and robust deities that are malevolent. And they have the power to interfere with the world, but certain other cosmic forces, like liminal barriers and the Aedra themselves, have ways of interfering with their attempts to interfere, to block them, such that they won't be able to totally do what they please with the realm of Mundus, which is mortal. It's kind of the contract and the impasse of the way that the world is designed, but evidently with the point of the plot of Oblivion, it doesn't have, a watertight system to it. So, these Ayleids were worshipping Daedra, and the Ayleids started doing a lot of bad things, as what happens when you get influenced by Daedra. And they, of course, enslaved the men. I believe from the last millennium of the Merethic era, and they started doing immensely cruel things, such as making these whaling whales of Vindicel that were kind of like torture devices they'd strapped them to, and they also had flesh and gut gardens of, I think, Sursen, which is another eyelid ruin. And suffice to say, I think the gods weren't getting too happy. The Needs surely weren't getting too happy with this. And many atrocities occurred until one such person among the Needs, who we call Alicia, which comes from an older name, I think Alesh, which I kind of make my character a nod to because I think it's like a poorly remembered part of the lore, becomes in a covenant with Akatosh, where Akatosh will share his blood. And I think that the mere transfusion of this divine essence with a human made her transcend into a leader that was capable of taking different forces like demigods like Morahos, and who was the son of Kain, pulling a White Strake, who was basically like a time-traveling cyborg, if you believe some of the lore, and coalescing these forces and their armies from the north in Skyrim, as well as slave uprisings of the Needs in an army, and the Iliad Hatti civilization became low. They lost. And one thing the Iliads were doing was raising undead, which they might have gotten from the Soul Cairn through a conjuration method, perhaps rather than necromancy itself. And they were summoning armies of Daedra to work for them freely. So liminal barriers weren't really strongly defined in this case, and powerful elven sorcerers means a lot of Daedric pacts that can be signed before the day is over with. Well, Akatosh and the forces of man were able to put a stop to us. And the lore actually gets rather complex on the notion of Akatosh, but we'll get into that. Basically, Alicia, who was also known as a Paravans, which would mean like High Highness, became the Empress of Cyrodiil. And a lot of the lore, as far as like the unification of Cyrodiil and the building of the Empire, maybe is not so much important to what we're dealing with as things move forward, to how the world got to be. But some of this stuff is how the whole culture of Cyrodiil developed. You basically had, as I described earlier, some of the Aliads that disagreed with the Daedra worship, and there were even internecine Daedric Iliad worshipper wars, as we see one of the Iliad ruins ended up getting destroyed, I think by Meridia's followers, or the forces of Meridia herself. Suffice to say, these Iliads that disagreed with the other Iliads about worshipping Daedra ended up kind of siding with the humans. It wouldn't have totally been for theological reasons, but this was a major force, and those Iliads were kind of now subject to Alicia, but they still retain some of their privileges, with the exception, of course, of slavery. And if these ones were relying on slavery, their economy would have had to change fast, or just hit the ground as far as not having the resources to continue. In the world of the Elder Scrolls, of course, there are a lot of ways to get around the issue of not having labor. I feel like the Telvanni and other wizards, Sotha-Sil, the Dwemer, they could literally just automate with steampunk-style technology or Atronachs and get some sort of labor like that. I think later on you might find that the political convenience it was to Tiber Septon to unify Morrowind and Cyrodiil in an empire was hypocritical on Cyrodiil's part, because they made a big deal about their own slave rebellion from the Iliads, who like a lot of different elven domains ended up basically enslaving a lot of humans and other races. For example, of course, with the Bretons, there's serfdom. The word serf comes from servus, which means slave in antiquity. So serfs in medieval Europe, there was a reason the term was like that. It's because their station in life may as well have been equivalent to slavery. But it might have been a little bit hypocritical of the Cyrodiilic Empire to say, oh yeah, we didn't like slavery. Oh, but House Dress, you got all those slaves? Those Argonian Khajiit slaves? Fine, great, good job. But that was the way it was, because he wasn't going to go in there and take his massive army and take on the Almsivi and all the forces of Morrowind and exhaust and spend everything and maybe not be able to change the status quo anyway. So you can't always, take your own principle and be able to change it in such circumstances. But it was definitely kind of like a materially minded concern of building an empire, as far as allowing them, and maybe pragmatism as far as like, we just cannot win this. Maybe our empire will crumble. Maybe there will be anarchy. There are other political concerns you have to weigh. So we cannot extend that enfranchisement as we would want to across the empire. But at least fortunately, in the case of what we see with the Pax Cyrodiil that you have after Tiber Septim, is that everyone, with the exception of Morrowind, that would be of different like nationality, like Argonian, Khajiit, they have freedom within Cyrodiil's domain, and most of the empire